The night was thick with mist, curling around the ruins of a forgotten castle like ghostly fingers. A blood-red moon hung low in the sky, bathing the crumbling stone walls in its eerie glow. The world was silent. No birds, no insects, only the whisper of the wind through the dead trees. She stood at the heart of it all, a vision of cold, haunting beauty. Celine, the last of the night-born vampires, draped in a gown as dark as midnight, the silk clinging to her curves as if woven from shadow itself. Her silver eyes shimmered in the moonlight, a hypnotic contrast to the deep crimson of her lips. She was a creature of legend, a relic of an age where her kind ruled the night with an iron grip. But now, she was alone, a predator without a pack. Ronan had been watching her for some time. Hidden in the tree line, he had tracked her movements with the patience of a hunter, his golden eyes never leaving her form. He could smell her, something ancient, something forbidden. The scent of blood and roses, of hunger and death. It stirred something primal inside him, something neither man nor beast could fully understand. He stepped forward, the underbrush cracking beneath his heavy boots. The wind carried his scent to her, and she turned, slow and deliberate, as if she had known he was there all along. Her gaze met his, and the air between them tightened like a noose. He was massive, broad-shouldered, and towering, with raw power humming beneath his skin. The moonlight glinted off his sharp features, a warrior's face carved in stone, strong jaw, dark stubble, and lips set in a firm, unreadable line. His clothes were rough, torn in places from a recent shift, and the faintest trace of claws still lingered at his fingertips. Celine's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "You've been following me." Ronan didn't answer. He simply stalked closer, each step controlled, deliberate, his golden eyes dark with something dangerous. A warning. She tilted her head, her silk-like hair spilling over one shoulder. "You're not afraid of me." A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips. "Should I be?" She took a step forward, her movements fluid and impossibly graceful. "That depends." Her voice was a whisper, a velvet caress that sent an unnatural chill down his spine. "Do you fear temptation?" Ronan's fists clenched at his sides. His body was taut, every muscle coiled with restrained power. Everything about her was designed to lure, to ensnare. The way her breath came soft and steady, the way her pale skin glowed under the moonlight. It was an invitation and a warning wrapped into one. "Tell me why you're here," he growled, voice rough as gravel. Celine exhaled slowly, taking another step closer. She smelled of dark wine and something richer, something sinful. He could hear her heartbeat, or rather, the slow, unnatural stillness of it. "I need you," she said. The words struck something deep inside him, something instinctive. His wolf stirred, restless beneath his skin, its need coiling with his own. He took another step, closing the distance between them. She was smaller than him, delicate, but there was nothing fragile about her. She was a storm in silk, a blade wrapped in beauty. "You came looking for a wolf," he murmured, voice thick with meaning. Celine met his gaze, unblinking. "I came looking for you." Silence stretched between them, filled with tension so thick it was suffocating. The night watched, waiting, as the last vampire and the lone werewolf stood face to face at the edge of something neither of them could control. Ronan's pulse thundered in his ears. He could taste her scent on the air, could feel the pull of something deeper than fate. He had spent years fighting against the wild thing inside him. But tonight, beneath the blood moon, it whispered a single truth. She was his, or she would be. One way or another. The air between them was thick with unspoken desire, dark and potent like a storm waiting to break. Celine stood still, her silver eyes gleaming in the moonlight, waiting for Ronan to react. She had offered him no explanations, no pleasantries, only a demand wrapped in temptation. Ronan's jaw tightened. His body was a coil of raw power, his wolf just beneath the surface, restless and wild. He had spent his life resisting the pull of instinct, but this woman, This vampire threatened to unravel every ounce of control he had left. "I don't belong to you," he said, voice rough as thunder. Celine smiled, slow and knowing. "No," she murmured, stepping closer. "But you will." His breath came heavier, the scent of her thick in his lungs. She was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Most vampires reeked of death, their presence unnatural, their touch a cold promise of suffering. But Celine was different. She smelled of something older, something forbidden. Midnight roses and lingering embers. She was a predator, yes, but she was also the last of her kind. And she had come to him. Ronan's golden eyes darkened. "What do you want from me?" Celine tilted her head, her voice a whisper of silk. "What only you can give me." His hands clenched at his sides, his muscles rigid. She was playing a dangerous game, but so was he. He had fought his entire life against the instincts of his kind, against the primal force that craved power, territory, a mate. But something in the way she looked at him, something in the way she stood, so fearless, so deadly, made his restraint feel like a fraying thread. "You expect me to help you rebuild a dying lineage?" he asked, his voice laced with something dark. Celine stepped closer, so close now that he could feel the unnatural stillness of her breath, could see the sharp hunger in her silver gaze. "I expect you to give me what I need." Ronan growled low, deep in his chest, the sound vibrating through the space between them. It was a warning, but Celine did not flinch. Instead, she lifted a single pale hand and pressed her fingers lightly against his chest. His skin burned where she touched him, a searing contrast to her unnatural coldness. "You fight what you are," she whispered, tracing the edge of a scar that cut across his collarbone. "But the beast inside you, it knows." His breathing turned heavy. His hands itched to grab her, to pin her against the stone walls of the ruined castle, to show her that no creature, vampire or not, could control them. But she wasn't just any creature. Celine's lips parted slightly, her fangs barely visible in the moonlight. "You feel it, don't you?" Ronan exhaled sharply, his control slipping by the second. He had spent years keeping his wolf at bay, refusing to surrender to the savage hunger of his kind. But she was awakening something in him, something primal. Celine lifted her gaze to his, her voice barely a whisper. "Help me." Something inside him snapped. Faster than she could react, he moved. One moment, she was standing before him, teasing him with her presence. The next, she was pressed against the cold stone wall, trapped between it and the sheer force of him. His hands gripped her wrists, pinning them above her head, his body caging hers in a way that left no room for escape. Her breath hitched, her silver eyes widening, but not with fear, with something darker, something just as dangerous as what burned inside him. "You think you can use me?" he growled, his voice thick with restraint. "You think I'll just give you what you want?" Celine didn't fight him. She didn't struggle, didn't beg. Instead, she smiled, a slow, wicked smile that sent a sharp pulse of heat through his blood. "I think," she murmured, her voice a blade laced with honey, "you won't be able to resist." Roman's grip on her wrists tightened. His wolf howled within him, demanding, burning. He knew she was right, and that was the most dangerous truth of all. The air between them was electric, crackling with something neither of them dared to name. Ronan could feel it, his wolf clawing at the edges of his restraint, demanding to claim, to conquer. But Celine, she stood before him, unshaken, her silver eyes glowing with a hunger that went beyond blood. It was something deeper, something forbidden. "You fight it," she whispered, tilting her head as if studying a creature she could not quite tame. "But why?" Ronan's hands curled into fists at his sides. His body was rigid, every muscle coiled and barely contained tension. He had spent years resisting his primal urges, keeping his nature on a leash. But she, this woman, this vampire, was unraveling him without even trying. Celine stepped forward, slow, deliberate. She moved like mist, her black cloak sweeping across the stone floor, her presence an intoxicating force. When she reached him, she placed a cold, delicate hand against his chest. His breath caught. "I can hear your heart," she murmured, tracing a line down to where his pulse thundered beneath his skin. Strong, unrelenting. And yet, her gaze flicked up to meet his. "It beats for me." Ronan growled low in his throat, a sound more beast than man. He should have pushed her away, should have ended this dangerous game before it consumed them both. But instead, he grabbed her wrist, holding it firm against his chest, letting her feel the wild rhythm beneath her fingers. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said, his voice rough, edged with something dark. Celine smiled, slow and knowing. "Don't I?" His grip tightened for a brief moment before he let her go. She did not retreat. Instead, she pressed closer, the scent of her, moonlit roses, and something ancient, wrapping around him like a spell. "I am the last of my kind," she whispered. "If I die, my lineage dies with me. You are the only one strong enough to help me." Ronan's jaw clenched. The idea of a vampire and a werewolf together, it was unthinkable. Blasphemous. Their species had been at war for centuries. He had killed her kind. She had killed his. And yet, standing here, with her pressed against him, her voice like a dark melody in his ear, none of it seemed to matter. He reached up, his fingers brushing a strand of raven black hair from her face. "You are playing with fire, vampire." Celine's lips parted slightly, her breath cool against his skin. "Then burn me." Something inside him snapped. In a blur, he spun her around, pinning her against the stone pillar behind them. She gasped, the sharp edge of surprise flickering in her silver eyes, but there was no fear, only challenge. His hands pressed against the cold surface beside her head, trapping her in place. "You think you can tame me?" he growled. Celine exhaled a soft, breathy laugh, her lips curving. "I don't need to tame you, wolf," she whispered. "I only need you to stop fighting what's already inside you." Ronan's chest rose and fell with deep, steady breaths. She was right. He had known it from the moment he had laid eyes on her. His body, his instincts, they had already chosen. No matter how much he fought, he was bound to her in a way he could not escape. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her silver eyes. A single word left his mouth, low and dangerous. "Run." Celine didn't move. She lifted a hand, pressing her palm to his cheek, her voice soft yet unyielding. "No." His control shattered. With a growl, he closed the space between them, his body claiming hers in a way that no words ever could. The world around them vanished. No war, no past, no laws forbidding what they had become. There was only the night. Only them. The storm outside raged like the war within him. Ronan paced the length of the ancient chamber, his breath rough, his muscles wound tight with barely contained fury. The scent of her still clung to him, sweet, intoxicating, laced with something dangerous. Celine had shattered the boundaries he had clung to for so long, unraveling him thread by thread until only the beast remained. And now she stood before him, watching, waiting. The candlelight flickered across her porcelain skin, highlighting the elegant curve of her throat, the dark hunger in her silver eyes. She was fearless, even in the presence of a predator who had every reason to despise her. "I told you to run," Ronan growled, voice thick with warning. Celine stepped closer, unshaken. "And I told you no." His jaw clenched. The fire inside him burned hotter, spreading like wildfire through his veins. She was testing him, pushing him toward the edge of control, and God's help him, he wanted to fall. He crossed the distance between them in a single breath, his presence swallowing hers, his towering frame casting her into shadow. A lesser creature would have cowered beneath his dominance. But Celine, she lifted her chin, eyes gleaming with something wicked. "You think you can command me, wolf," she murmured. "That I will break so easily." Ronan's hand shot out, fingers wrapping around her wrist, not to harm, but to feel the pulse that did not beat beneath her skin, a reminder of what she was, a temptation he could not resist. "You've already broken me," he admitted, voice low, raw. Celine's lips parted, the ghost of a smile forming. Then stopped fighting it. His fingers traced up her arm, slow, deliberate, his touch both a threat and a promise. The air between them pulsed with something dark, something forbidden, and yet neither of them moved away. "You're playing with fire," he whispered. Celine tilted her head, eyes locked onto his. "And you're afraid to burn." His patience snapped. With a growl, he spun her around, pressing her back against the cold stone wall. She gasped, but there was no fear, only challenge, only desire. His hands gripped the rough edges beside her, caging her in. She was small compared to him, fragile in ways he could not comprehend, and yet she held more power over him than anything ever had. Her fingers brushed over his jaw, tracing the line of his throat, his pulse pounding beneath her touch. "You're trembling," she whispered. Ronan bared his teeth. "Because I'm fighting myself." Celine's breath was cool against his skin. "Then don't." A sharp exhale escaped him. His body screamed for her, instincts demanding he take what was his. But a war raged within him still. If he gave in, there would be no turning back. Their worlds would collide, their bloodlines forever entwined in something unnatural, something monstrous. But none of that mattered now. Not when she was looking at him like this. Not when he knew he would destroy anyone who tried to take her from him. Slowly, agonizingly, he leaned in. Their lips hovered, breaths mingling. The moment stretched between hesitation and surrender. Celine's eyes flickered closed, and Ronan knew there was no more running. His mouth claimed hers in a kiss that was nothing short of war, wild, consuming, filled with everything they had denied for too long. She melted into him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her cold body pressing against his burning heat. The storm outside howled, but inside this room, the battle was already won. She was his, and he was hers. The night was thick with mist, the scent of rain lingering in the air as Ronan led Celine through the ruins of the forgotten world. His steps were heavy, purposeful, while hers were light, almost soundless, like a wraith gliding through the darkness. She belonged to the night, a creature of moonlight and death, wrapped in an elegance that could shatter a man's will. And yet here she was, following him, walking beside a beast bred to destroy her kind. The truth of it clawed at Ronan's insides. He should have killed her. Should have torn out the temptation at its root before it had the chance to consume him. But he hadn't. He couldn't. Celine watched him from the corner of her eye, her silver irises glowing like twin stars. "You're quiet," she murmured. Ronan kept walking, his jaw tightening. "And you're reckless." A soft chuckle escaped her lips. Perhaps. She stepped ahead of him, spinning to block his path. The ruins framed her like an ancient queen, the moonlight kissing the pale curves of her face. "Tell me what haunts you, wolf," she whispered. Ronan's gaze darkened. He could feel his control fraying, stretched too thin by the hunger clawing at his bones. She was too close, her presence weaving through his senses like a spell. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, every part of him screaming for restraint. Celine reached for him, her cold hand pressing against his chest. He growled low in his throat, but she didn't recoil. She never did. "You're holding back," she observed, tilting her head. Ronan's hand shot out, gripping her wrists with enough force to shatter stone. She gasped, but there was no fear in her eyes, only challenge, only something dangerously close to amusement. "You don't understand what you're asking for," he rasped. Celine leaned in, her breath like ice against his throat. "Then make me understand." A muscle in Ronan's jaw twitched. She was testing him again, pushing him closer to the breaking point. He wanted to push her away, to reclaim the control that had been slipping through his fingers since the moment they met. But then she spoke again, her voice softer this time, a whisper laced with something raw. "I'm already yours, Ronan." Something inside him snapped. With a growl, he yanked her flush against him, his grip firm but careful, as though he feared she would vanish. Her body was cold against his heat, fragile yet unyielding. He could feel the stillness of her, the absence of a heartbeat, and yet she was the most alive thing he had ever touched. Celine arched against him, her fingers tangling in his hair. "Stop fighting me," she whispered. His forehead pressed against hers, his breath ragged. "This will ruin us both." She smiled, the sharp edge of her fangs glinting in the moonlight. "Then let's be ruined together." Ronan crashed his lips against hers, his kiss fierce, claiming, a silent vow that words could never capture. She responded just as fiercely, her fingers curling into his skin, as if she could brand herself into him. The ruins stood as silent witnesses to their surrender. The wind howled through the broken stone, carrying with it the whispers of a love that should not exist, wild, forbidden, and unstoppable. The beast had finally fallen, and the vampire had won. The night whispered through the ruins, its breath cold against their tangled bodies. The storm clouds had scattered, revealing a moon so full it bled silver across the world. Ronan stood against the crumbling stone, his powerful frame tense, as if he were a beast caught between desire and restraint. Celine stood before him, untouched by the passage of time, her beauty otherworldly. The wind stirred her raven-black hair, and her silver eyes gleamed with something dark, something knowing. She had tasted his hunger. She had felt the way his body had claimed her, even as his mind fought against it. "You're still resisting," she murmured, stepping closer. Her voice was velvet, wrapping around him like a spell. "Why?" Ronan's fists clenched. His breath was uneven, ragged. "Because I know what happens when I lose control." Celine tilted her head, studying him. Then, in a single fluid motion, she placed her cold fingers against his bare chest, right over the steady, pounding rhythm of his heart. "And what if I want you to?" A growl rumbled deep in his throat. He wanted her in ways that defied reason, in ways that should terrify them both. His wolf howled beneath his skin, demanding, aching to mark what was his. But Ronan had spent his life mastering control. He would not break so easily. Celine's lips curled into a smirk, as if she could hear the battle raging inside him. "You act as if this fight still matters." "It does." His voice was rough, but his grip on restraint was slipping. She stepped even closer, until her body pressed against his heat, until her scent wrapped around him like a vice. "No, it doesn't," she whispered, "because you have already chosen me." Ronan's jaw clenched. She was right. His hands moved before he could stop them, sliding up her arms, over her shoulders, tracing the delicate shape of her throat. He felt the absence of a pulse beneath his fingers, the stillness of her, and yet she was fire in his hands, burning, consuming. Celine's breath hitched, but she didn't move away. She wanted this, wanted him. And God's help him, he wanted her too. The moonlight framed them like a prophecy, a warning of what should never be. A werewolf and a vampire. The eternal enemies. The destined lovers. His thumb brushed over her lips, feeling the sharp edge of her fangs. She parted them slightly, her silver gaze darkening. A silent invitation. A challenge. Ronan's restraint shattered. With a growl, he pinned her against the cold stone, his body a wall of heat against hers. She gasped, but her hands clutched his shoulders, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. She wanted the fire just as much as he did. His lips claimed hers, fierce, demanding, devouring. She met him with the same wild hunger, her fingers tangling in his hair, her nails raking against his skin. She tasted like midnight, like forbidden dreams, like something he could never have enough of. The ruins trembled around them, as if the very earth understood the danger of what they had done. Celine pulled back slightly, her breathing unsteady, her silver eyes flickering with something raw, something new. No turning back now, Wolf. Ronan's gaze burned into hers. I never wanted to. And as the night wrapped its shadows around them, the war that should have kept them apart fell silent. Because in this moment, there was no vampire. There was no werewolf. There was only them. The night stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the steady rhythm of their breaths. The ruins stood as ancient witnesses to their sins, to the battle waged between desire and fate. The air was thick with something unspoken, something neither of them dared to name. Ronan's body was a coiled storm, his muscles tense, even as his hand traced slow, deliberate patterns over Celine's porcelain skin. He was no longer fighting the truth. She was his, in ways no force in this world could undo. But the war within him had not faded. A werewolf's nature was to claim, to mark what belonged to him. But a vampire's soul was untouchable, forever cursed to exist between life and death. How could something as primal as his love ever be enough to anchor her to him? Celine must have sensed the hesitation in him because she tilted her head, studying him with those eerie silver eyes. She had spent centuries bending mortals and monsters alike to her will, yet here she stood, unguarded, offering herself to the only creature who had ever made her feel alive. "You're still afraid," she whispered. Her fingers brushed over his jaw, over the rough stubble that made him seem even more untamed, more dangerous. "Why?" Roman's gaze darkened. His voice was rough, heavy with the weight of his torment. "Because this will destroy us." Celine's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then let it." The words shattered something inside him. A growl rumbled from deep within his chest as he pulled her closer, his fingers threading into her midnight hair, tugging just enough to make her gasp. Her body melted against his, a cold flame against his searing heat. She was everything he had ever craved, everything he had sworn to resist. But resistance was a lie. He had already surrendered to her. His lips brushed against the curve of her throat, where her pulse should have been but never was. She was a contradiction, both fragile and deadly, untouchable yet utterly his. He could feel the sharp edge of her fangs just beneath the surface of her skin, the silent promise of what she was capable of. She arched into him, her breath uneven, her body betraying the hunger she fought to control. A vampire's thirst was eternal, but this was something more, something deeper. Her fingers trailed over his chest, tracing the scars that marked his battles, his pain. "I don't fear the ruin, Ronan," she murmured. "I fear nothing but losing you." His grip on her tightened. The beast inside him roared, demanding that he prove she would never have to. "You won't." His voice was a promise, a vow written in the fire between them. Celine's gaze flickered, a brief moment of vulnerability before the storm returned. "Then stop holding back." Ronan didn't need to be told twice. His lips crashed against hers, devouring, claiming. She met him with the same hunger, the same fury, as if the stars themselves would burn out before she let him go. The ruins trembled around them, the wind howling like a warning, or a blessing. The world did not matter. The war did not matter. All that remained was the undeniable truth. She was his, and he would set the world ablaze before he let her go. The night was still, but the storm inside them had only just begun. The ruins lay in eerie silence, the wind whispering through the broken stone, carrying the scent of ancient blood and wild earth. Ronan stood at the edge of the crumbling tower, his broad shoulders tense, his gaze locked onto the woman who had undone him. Celine moved toward him, her silver eyes glistening in the moonlight, her presence as haunting as it was beautiful. The darkness clung to her like a lover, but it no longer belonged to her alone. She belonged to him now, and he to her. "You're thinking too much," she murmured, stopping just a breath away. Ronan clenched his jaw. His instincts screamed at him to take, to claim, to brand her in a way no force in this world could erase. But the beast in him warred with the man who feared losing the only thing he had ever truly wanted. "I have to think," he rasped, "because once I do this, there's no turning back." Celine's lips curved, slow and knowing. You've already chosen me, Ronan. He exhaled sharply, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. He reached for her, his large hands framing her delicate face, his touch firm, possessive. Her skin was cold, but the fire in her gaze burned hotter than any flame he had ever known. Her fingers slid over his chest, pressing against the rapid thud of his heart. You are bound to me, she whispered, just as I am to you. Ronan growled low in his throat, the truth of her words cutting deeper than any blade. He had spent his life fighting fate, denying what was written in the stars. But this had never been a choice. This had always been destiny. Celine's breath hitched as he pulled her against him, his heat consuming her, his strength caging her in. She welcomed it, welcomed the wildfire that had taken hold of them both. His lips brushed against her ear, his voice rough, dangerous. Say it. She shivered, tilting her head to him, baring her throat in silent surrender. I am yours. A deep primal sound rumbled from his chest. The words shattered whatever restraint he had left. His lips crashed against hers, fierce and unrelenting, his body pressing her back against the ancient stone. She met him with equal hunger, her fingers tangling in his hair, her sharp nails digging into his skin. She was untamed, a goddess of the night, and he was the beast who would worship her, ruin her, and love her beyond reason. Celine pulled back slightly, her silver gaze searching his. Will you do it? She whispered. Ronan didn't hesitate. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her throat, feeling the stillness beneath her skin. A werewolf's mark was forever, a claim that could not be undone. And she was asking for it. His fangs elongated, sharp against her flesh. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She only gripped him tighter, her trust absolute. Mine, he growled. And then he sank his teeth into her. Celine gasped, her body arching against his as a rush of heat spread through her veins. It wasn't pain. It was something deeper, something raw, a tether binding them together in a way that no war, no prophecy, could break. The moon above them burned bright, as if blessing the union of two creatures who were never meant to love. But love they did, and as Ronan lifted his head, his golden eyes meeting hers, she knew. They had sealed their fate. Together, they would walk the path of ruin, and they would never look back.